3 months after a billionaire asked her to marry him, Ava Brooks would walk into a charity gala and come face to face with the men who had stolen her entire future. If someone had told Ava that story a year earlier, she would have laughed and kept carrying concrete blocks across a construction site. Back then, survival was the only thing that mattered. Long before sunrise painted the skyline of Charlotte, North Carolina, Ava was already awake. The city was still quiet when she folded the thin blanket she slept under and stood from the corner of an unfinished building she secretly called home. The concrete floor beneath her feet was cold. The air carried the faint smell of dust and rain. She stretched her aching shoulders, slipped on her worn work boots, and prepared for another day. There was no one waiting for her, no family checking on her, no apartment lights glowing in the distance. Just another morning and another chance to earn enough money to make it through the next day. Ava moved through the streets with the confidence of someone who had learned how to disappear. Most people never noticed her. The commuters rushing toward office buildings did not see her. The drivers stopped at traffic lights did not see her. To them, she was just another laborer in a city full of laborers. But Ava noticed everything. She noticed who treated workers with respect and who did not. She noticed which store owners greeted people kindly and which ones looked down on them. Most importantly, she noticed opportunities. By 6 o'clock, she had reached the construction site. The noise started almost immediately. Engines rumbled. Equipment moved. Supervisors shouted instructions. Men twice her size prepared for the day ahead. Ava grabbed her gloves and went straight to work. She carried heavy materials from one side of the site to the other, with a determination that surprised almost everyone who met her. The younger workers often joked that she worked harder than all of them combined. Ava never argued. She simply kept moving. Lift, walk, deliver, repeat. Every trip felt like another step away from the helpless girl she used to be. Around mid-morning, one of the workers shook his head as she carried another stack of materials. "You ever take a break?" he asked. Ava smiled faintly. "When the work is finished." The man laughed, but she was serious. Rest had become a luxury she rarely allowed herself. As the sun climbed higher, sweat rolled down her face, her muscles burned, her hands ached. Still, she continued. Nobody there knew that she had once lived in a gated estate. Nobody knew she had attended private schools and dreamed of running her father's company one day. Nobody knew that everything had vanished after a single tragedy changed her life forever. To the people around her, Ava Brooks was simply a homeless construction worker. And that morning, as she lifted another load onto her shoulder, she had no idea that someone was already on his way to the site. Someone powerful. Someone successful. Someone whose arrival would quietly begin changing everything she thought she knew about her future. Ava did not notice the black SUV pulling into the construction site until several workers suddenly stopped talking. Conversations that had filled the air only seconds earlier faded into murmurs. Even the site supervisor straightened his posture and brushed dust from his shirt. Ava glanced up briefly before returning to work. Whoever had arrived clearly mattered to everyone else. It did not matter to her. She had another load to deliver and no time for distractions. The driver's door opened first. Then another vehicle stopped behind it. A few people stepped out, dressed in business attire that looked completely out of place among piles of steel beams and concrete. Finally, a tall man emerged from the second vehicle. He was dressed simply compared to the others, but there was something unmistakable about the way people reacted to him. Respect followed him naturally. His name was Malcolm Carter, and he owned the development project that employed hundreds of workers across the city. At 35 years old, Malcolm had built one of the fastest-growing real estate companies in the Southeast. Yet instead of heading directly toward the supervisor, he paused and studied the site. He watched the workers. He watched the equipment. He watched the rhythm of the operation. Then his attention settled on Ava. She was carrying materials across the site with a focus that stood out immediately. Most workers slowed down occasionally. Most stopped to talk. Ava did neither. Malcolm watched her complete one trip, then another, then another. There was no attempt to impress anyone, no performance, just discipline. The supervisor rushed over with a broad smile. Malcolm listened politely as updates about schedules and budgets were delivered, but part of his attention remained elsewhere. After several minutes, he interrupted. "Who is she?" The supervisor followed his gaze. "The woman carrying the concrete forms." Malcolm nodded. "Her." The supervisor shrugged. "Ava. She has been working here for months. Quiet, reliable, never causes problems." Malcolm looked back toward her. "She works harder than most of the crew." The supervisor laughed softly. "That is true." Meanwhile, Ava finished another delivery and reached for a bottle of water. She took a small sip, careful not to waste any. When she looked up, she realized someone was standing nearby. Malcolm offered a polite nod. "Good morning." Ava nodded back. "Morning." His voice was calm. "How long have you been working here?" "Long enough." Malcolm almost smiled at the answer. "Do you like the work?" Ava glanced around the dusty site. "It pays." "That wasn't my question." For a moment, she considered walking away. Instead, she answered honestly. "I don't need to like it. I need it." Malcolm studied her expression. There was no bitterness in her voice, no self-pity, just reality. "That is fair," he said. A whistle sounded from across the site. Ava adjusted her gloves. "I should get back to work." Malcolm stepped aside. "Of course." She walked away without looking back. Most people tried to impress him within seconds of meeting him. Ava seemed completely uninterested. Strangely, that made him more curious. As he continued his inspection, he found himself watching her again and again. By the time he returned to his vehicle that afternoon, one thought remained in his mind. For reasons he could not explain, he wanted to know more about the woman who acted as if he were no different from anyone else. Malcolm told himself he had no reason to return to the construction site the next day. Yet shortly after 9 o'clock, his vehicle rolled through the gates again. Officially, he was there to review progress reports. Unofficially, he found himself searching for one person. Ava was exactly where he expected her to be. She was carrying supplies across the site with the same quiet determination that had captured his attention the day before. Nothing about her seemed calculated. Nothing seemed designed to attract sympathy or admiration. She simply worked. Over the next week, Malcolm visited the site more often than necessary. The supervisors noticed. The workers noticed. Even Ava noticed, although she pretended not to. Each visit brought another short conversation. At first, the exchanges were simple. Questions about work, questions about the weather, questions about long hours and difficult schedules. Yet every answer Ava gave revealed something unexpected. One afternoon, Malcolm noticed a worn paperback book resting beside her water bottle during lunch. Most people would not have looked twice, but he recognized the title immediately. It was a business strategy book often assigned in graduate programs. He picked it up carefully. "You read this?" he asked. Ava glanced at the cover. "Sometimes. It is not exactly light reading," she shrugged. "I like learning." Malcolm studied her. "Where did you find it?" "A library sale." "And you understood it?" A faint smile touched her face. "Most of it." That answer stayed with him. Later that day, he asked another question. "Did you go to college?" Ava hesitated. The pause was brief but noticeable. For a while. "What did you study?" She adjusted her gloves. "Business." Malcolm looked genuinely surprised. Before he could ask more, Ava lifted another load and walked away. That evening, the answer echoed in his mind. business. Nothing about her situation matched the life she should have been living. A few days later, rain clouds gathered over Charlotte and forced the crew to stop early. Workers rushed to their cars or buses, while Ava remained beneath a covered section of the site, waiting for the storm to pass. Malcolm happened to be there reviewing plans. For the first time, they found themselves alone without noise or interruptions. Rain tapped steadily against the metal roof overhead. "Can I ask you something?" Malcolm said. Ava looked up. "You usually do." He laughed softly. "Fair point." Then his expression grew more serious. "What happened?" Ava knew exactly what he meant. Not what happened today. Not what happened at work. What happened to her life. She stared at the rain for several seconds. "A lot of things. Do you ever talk about it?" "Not really." Malcolm nodded. "You do not have to." Another silence settled between them. Then Ava surprised herself. "My father owned a company." Malcolm turned toward her. "A large company?" "Large enough." Her eyes remained fixed on the rain. "We had a good life." "What changed?" Ava swallowed carefully. "One night, everything disappeared." Malcolm waited. He did not interrupt. He did not push. For the first time in years, Ava felt as though someone was listening because they wanted to understand, not because they were curious. And for reasons she could not explain, part of her was beginning to trust him. Ava did not tell the rest of her story that afternoon. When the rain finally stopped, she stood, picked up her gloves, and returned to work as if nothing had happened. Yet something had changed. For the first time in years, someone knew there was more to her than the woman carrying construction materials across a muddy job site. Over the next several days, Malcolm found himself thinking about her constantly. He had met executives, investors, politicians, and celebrities. Most of them spoke endlessly about themselves. Ava was different. Every answer she gave revealed just enough to raise another question. One evening, after the crew had finished for the day, Malcolm approached her again. The sky was turning orange as the sun dipped below the city skyline. "Have dinner with me," he said calmly. Ava looked at him as if he had suggested something impossible. "Why?" Malcolm smiled slightly. "Most people would ask where." "I'm not most people." "That is exactly why I am asking." Ava studied him for a moment. She had spent years learning not to trust easily. Promises had disappeared. People had disappeared. Entire chapters of her life had disappeared. Yet there was something steady about Malcolm. He never pressured her. He never treated her like a project that needed fixing. "It is just dinner," he added. "One conversation." Ava looked away briefly. "I do not have clothes for places you probably eat." Malcolm surprised her again. "Then we will go somewhere that doesn't care." The answer stayed with her long after he left. 2 days later, she agreed. The restaurant was small and quiet, tucked between older brick buildings in a part of Charlotte most tourists never visited. Malcolm had chosen it carefully. No reporters, no business associates, no attention, just food and conversation. At first, Ava felt uncomfortable sitting across from him. The tablecloths were clean. The lighting was warm. The atmosphere reminded her of another life she had spent years trying not to remember. Malcolm noticed her hesitation. "You can leave if you want." Ava shook her head. "No, I am fine." After a few minutes, the conversation began to flow naturally. Malcolm talked about growing up in a middle-class neighborhood and building his company from the ground up. Ava listened carefully. Then eventually, he asked the question he'd been wondering about for weeks. "What happened after your father died?" Ava stared at her glass for several seconds. "My mother passed away a few months later." Malcolm felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she nodded. "After that, relatives took control of everything." "Everything?" Ava laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. The company, the house, the accounts, every piece of my father's life. Malcolm frowned. What about you? Apparently, I was not part of the inheritance they wanted. The words were calm, but the pain behind them was impossible to miss. Malcolm remained silent, allowing her to continue. One day, I was living in a 6-bedroom home. A few months later, I was sleeping wherever I could find shelter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Malcolm said something unexpected. They may have taken your circumstances, Ava, but they clearly failed to take who you are. For the first time that evening, her guarded expression softened completely, and somewhere deep inside, a small piece of the wall she had built around her heart began to crack. The weeks that followed felt different in ways Ava could not fully explain. She still woke before sunrise. She still worked long hours. She still returned each night to the unfinished building that served as her shelter. Yet the loneliness that had once followed her everywhere seemed less powerful. Malcolm had become a constant presence in her life, not overwhelming, not intrusive, simply present. He called occasionally. He stopped by the site whenever his schedule allowed. Most importantly, he listened. One Saturday afternoon, he arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag. Ava looked at him suspiciously. "What is that?" Malcolm placed the bag on a nearby table. "Lunch." She folded her arms. "You keep trying to feed me?" "Because you keep forgetting to eat." Ava almost smiled. Almost. They sat beneath a covered area overlooking the project. Workers had the weekend off, leaving the site unusually quiet. Malcolm glanced toward a stack of materials near the fence. "You know more about this business than half the managers I have hired." Ava laughed softly. "That cannot be true." "It is." He pointed toward several shipments waiting to be unloaded. "Last week, you predicted which supplier would deliver late. They always deliver late." "Exactly." Malcolm leaned forward slightly. "You understand inventory. You understand quality. You understand construction schedules." Ava looked away. "That does not mean anything. I think it means more than you realize." His words stayed with her throughout the day. 3 evenings later, Malcolm invited her to visit a small commercial property he owned. Ava expected another restaurant. Instead, they stopped in front of an empty storefront located on a busy corner near several active developments. The windows were clean. The building was modest but well-maintained. "Why are we here?" she asked. Malcolm unlocked the front door. "Come inside." Ava stepped across the threshold and looked around. Shelving lined the walls. Storage space occupied the rear section. It was clearly designed for business. "What is this place?" Malcolm turned toward her. "An opportunity." Ava frowned. "For who?" "For you." She stared at him. "No." The answer came immediately. Malcolm nodded calmly as if he had expected it. "You have not even heard the proposal." "I do not need to." "Why?" "Because people do not give away businesses." Malcolm crossed his arms. "Good. Then stop thinking about it as a gift." That caught her attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean I believe you can run a building supply company." Ava blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood him. "A what?" "A business supplying materials to contractors and construction crews." She shook her head. "I carry materials. I do not own companies." Malcolm smiled slightly. "Your father did." The room fell silent. Ava had not expected him to say that. That was a different life. "Maybe," Malcolm replied. "Or maybe it was preparation for this one." Ava looked around the empty space again. For the first time, she did not see an abandoned storefront. She saw possibility. Then Malcolm handed her a folder. "Read this tonight." She accepted it cautiously. "What is it?" Malcolm's expression grew serious. "A business plan." As Ava opened the folder, A folded document slipped from the back and landed on the floor. She bent down to pick it up. At first it looked unimportant. Then her eyes caught a familiar name printed near the bottom of the page. James Brooks, her father's name. For several seconds, Ava could not move. Her father's name stared back at her from the document, as if it had traveled through time to find her. The noise of the street outside faded. The empty storefront disappeared. All she could see was the signature line and the familiar company name she had not spoken aloud in years. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. Malcolm stepped closer. "I found it in an archive box, while reviewing older development records." Ava looked up. "You never told me you had documents connected to my father." "Because I did not know they were connected to your father until recently." She looked back at the paper. It appeared to be part of an old supplier agreement. Nothing extraordinary at first glance. Yet one detail immediately caught her attention. The date. It had been created only a few weeks before her father's death. Ava felt her pulse quicken. "This is impossible." Malcolm frowned. "What is it?" Her finger moved toward a section near the bottom. "This company listed here was one of my father's major suppliers." Malcolm studied the page. "Do you recognize it?" Ava nodded slowly. "Very well." A strange feeling settled over her. Not grief, not nostalgia, suspicion. Something about the document felt wrong. Later that night, she sat alone in the unfinished building with a flashlight and read every page inside the folder. Most of the business plan focused on the storefront Malcolm wanted her to operate. Yet her attention kept returning to the document bearing her father's name. Around midnight, she noticed something unusual. Several reference numbers matched records she vaguely remembered from childhood. Her father had always been meticulous. He labeled everything: contracts, accounts, inventories. She remembered because he used to joke that organization was a superpower. The next morning, Ava arrived at the site carrying the document inside her backpack. Throughout the day, she could barely concentrate. Questions kept circling through her mind. Why had this record survived? Why had it appeared now? And why did she feel as though it connected to something much larger? That afternoon, Malcolm visited again. One look at Ava's face told him something was different. "You found something?" Ava nodded. "Maybe." She handed him the paper. "Look at these numbers." Malcolm studied the section she pointed toward. "I am not sure what I am seeing." "Neither am I," Ava admitted, "but I know they matter." Malcolm remained silent for a moment. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "Have you ever tried investigating what happened after your father's death?" Ava laughed softly. "With what resources?" "Fair point. Besides," she continued, "for years I was focused on surviving. I never had time to look backward." Malcolm leaned against the table. "Maybe it is time." Ava stared at the document again. The idea felt dangerous. Looking into the past meant reopening wounds she had spent years trying to heal. Yet another feeling had begun to grow stronger than fear. Curiosity. Then Malcolm said something that changed everything. "Ava, if someone took what belonged to you, would you want to know?" She looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Yes," Malcolm nodded. "Then let us find out what really happened." Neither of them realized it yet, but somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man named Victor Brooks was about to receive news that Ava Brooks was no longer missing from the story he thought had ended years ago. The following week moved faster than Ava expected. During the day, she continued working at the construction site, while spending her evenings learning everything she could about the storefront Malcolm wanted her to manage. Yet beneath the excitement of a possible new future, another story was quietly unfolding. Malcolm had asked a private research firm to review public records connected to James Brooks and the companies he once owned. At first, the results seemed ordinary. Business registrations, property transfers, corporate filings. Then a pattern emerged. Several valuable assets had changed ownership within months of James Brooks's death. What made the transfers unusual was not that they happened, it was how quickly they happened. One evening, Malcolm sat across from Ava inside the empty storefront, while folders covered a nearby table. "Take a look at this," he said. Ava studied the paperwork. Her eyes moved from page to page. Then she froze. "I know this address." Malcolm leaned forward. "You do?" She nodded slowly. "That was one of my father's warehouses." Malcolm handed her another file. "And this?" Ava stared at it. "An office building downtown." She looked up. "My father owned both of these." Malcolm nodded. According to these records, they were transferred less than 4 months after his death. Ava felt a chill run through her. "That should not have happened." "Why not?" Malcolm asked. "Because my father always said those properties were protected through family trusts." Silence settled between them. For the first time, the possibility of wrongdoing felt real. Not imagined, not emotional. Documented. Later that night, Ava could not sleep. She sat alone reviewing copies of the records. Every page seemed to raise more questions than answers. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. The message came from Malcolm. "Call me when you are awake tomorrow. I found something else." The next morning, she called immediately. Malcolm sounded unusually serious. "Ava, one of the investigators located someone who used to work closely with your father." Ava sat upright. "Who?" "His former accountant." Her heart skipped. "He is still alive?" "Yes." Malcolm paused. "And he remembers your family." 2 days later, they met the accountant in a small office outside Charlotte. The elderly man studied Ava carefully the moment she entered. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his eyes widened. "You look exactly like your mother." Ava felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. No one had said those words in years. The accountant shook his head slowly. "I always wondered what happened to you." Malcolm exchanged a glance with Ava. "What do you mean?" The older man opened a drawer and removed a worn folder. "After your father's death, I was told the family had everything under control." He sighed. "Then suddenly, I was dismissed." Ava stared at him. "Dismissed by who?" The answer came immediately. "Victor Brooks." The room fell silent. Ava lowered her eyes toward the folder. Her uncle's name felt heavier now than it ever had before. Then the accountant slid a document across the desk. "I kept copies because something never felt right." Ava looked down at the page. Her breath caught. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. One belonged to Victor Brooks. Another belonged to a witness she had never heard of. And one signature space that should have contained her name was completely blank. The blank signature line haunted Ava long after she and Malcolm left the accountant's office. During the drive back to Charlotte, she barely spoke. Her eyes remained fixed on the copies resting in her lap. Every page seemed to confirm what she had tried not to believe. Someone had made decisions about her future without her knowledge. Someone had moved assets connected to her father's legacy while she was still a grieving young woman, struggling to understand what had happened to her family. Malcolm finally broke the silence. "What are you thinking?" Ava looked down at the documents. "I'm thinking that for years I blamed myself." He glanced toward her. "For what?" "For not fighting harder, for not asking more questions, for losing everything." She shook her head slowly. "But I was never given a chance." Malcolm nodded. "That is becoming very clear." Over the next several weeks, the investigation intensified. Additional records surfaced. Former employees were located. Old financial statements were reviewed. One by one, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The more they uncovered, the more troubling the story became. Several properties had been transferred through a chain of companies connected to Victor Brooks. Funds had been redirected. Corporate ownership structures had changed repeatedly, in ways that made tracing the assets difficult. Yet despite all the complexity, one fact remained simple. Ava's interests had never been properly represented. One afternoon, she sat across from a legal consultant Malcolm had hired. The woman reviewed a stack of records before looking directly at Ava. "I cannot make conclusions yet," she said carefully, "but I can tell you this. There are enough questions here to justify a formal review." Ava felt her heart race. "You mean there is a chance?" "There is more than a chance." The words stayed with her long after the meeting ended. For the first time since losing her family, hope felt connected to evidence instead of imagination. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. The storefront Malcolm had shown her was no longer empty. Shelves were installed. Inventory arrived. Contractors began stopping by. What started as an idea slowly transformed into a real business. Ava discovered something surprising about herself. She loved the work. She understood suppliers. She understood customer needs. She understood construction materials better than most people expected. Every successful day reminded her of something her father used to say. Knowledge never disappears. It waits for the moment you need it. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Malcolm was reviewing reports late one evening when his investigator contacted him directly. "We found another witness," the investigator said. Malcolm sat forward immediately. "Who?" "A former legal assistant who worked on several estate documents." Malcolm listened carefully as details emerged. Then his expression changed. "Are you certain?" "Completely." After ending the call, he stared at the wall for several seconds before dialing Ava's number. She answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" Malcolm took a slow breath. "Ava, I need you to sit down." Silence filled the line. "Why?" she asked quietly. Malcolm looked at the notes in front of him. "Because someone just confirmed that documents connected to your father's estate may have been altered after his death." On the other end of the call, Ava closed her eyes. For years, she had wondered whether she had simply been forgotten. Now, a far more unsettling possibility stood before her. Maybe she had never been forgotten at all. The weeks that followed felt like the slow unfolding of a truth that had spent years hiding in the shadows. What began as a few suspicious documents grew into a mountain of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Former employees came forward. Financial records were recovered. Property transfers were traced. Every discovery pointed toward the same conclusion. The story Ava had been told after her father's death was incomplete. One crisp autumn morning, she sat inside a conference room overlooking downtown Charlotte while attorneys reviewed their final findings. Malcolm sat beside her. Neither spoke much. There was no need. The evidence spoke for itself. When the lead attorney finished presenting the report, the room fell silent. Ava looked down at the stack of documents in front of her. Years of questions finally had answers. Several properties that should have remained under trust protection had been transferred improperly. Corporate assets connected to her father's companies had been redirected. Most importantly, records confirmed that Ava's legal interests had never been fully represented during critical decisions involving the estate. She felt many emotions at once, but anger was not the strongest among them. Relief was. The uncertainty that had followed her for years was finally gone. She had not imagined the inconsistencies. She had not misunderstood her father's intentions. She had simply been denied the truth. Outside the conference room, Malcolm waited quietly while she gathered her thoughts. When she finally stepped into the hallway, he looked at her carefully. "How do you feel?" Ava stared through the glass windows at the city below. "Lighter." Malcolm nodded. "That makes sense." She smiled faintly. "For years, I thought closure would feel dramatic. And it does not." She looked back toward him. "It feels peaceful." Over the following months, legal processes moved forward. Some assets were restored. Several properties returned to structures that reflected her father's original plans. Financial settlements followed. The details mattered, but not as much as the lesson hidden beneath them. Ava had spent years believing that everything valuable had been taken from her. Now she understood something different. The most valuable parts of her life had survived. Her work ethic survived. Her integrity survived. Her ability to trust survived. Most surprisingly, her capacity to love survived. Meanwhile, the building supply business continued growing faster than anyone expected. Contractors recommended her company to other contractors. New projects appeared. Additional locations were discussed. Customers trusted Ava because she understood their world. She had carried the materials herself. She had lived the work. One evening, nearly a year after Malcolm first noticed her on the construction site, they stood together on a rooftop overlooking the Charlotte skyline. The city lights stretched across the horizon like thousands of small possibilities. For a while, neither spoke. Then Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket. Ava immediately laughed. "You are nervous." Malcolm shook his head. "I'm trying to be serious. You are failing." That made him smile. Then his expression softened. "Ava, before I met you, I thought success meant building companies." He paused. "Now, I know it means building a life with the right person." Her eyes met his. The city seemed to disappear around them. "I spent years afraid of losing good things," she admitted quietly. "I know. But I'm not afraid anymore." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Good." Several months later, at a charity gala honoring educational programs for underserved communities, Ava stood before a crowd and announced the creation of the James and Eleanor Brooks Scholarship Foundation. It would help young people pursue opportunities regardless of their circumstances. As applause filled the room, she glanced toward Malcolm and smiled. The future ahead remained unwritten. Challenges would come. Life would continue changing. But for the first time in many years, Ava welcomed the uncertainty, because she had learned that losing everything was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of discovering who she was, always meant to become. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel.